There we go. Whoops. So, good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good weekend. We're live streaming now, so hopefully some people from online will stop in and say hello because I've said good morning. Oh, there we go. So Ananda's here. Good morning, Ananda. So nobody, you're telling me nobody did anything fun over the weekend? Not a single fun thing? You didn't like eat some good food? You didn't like have sushi or watch a movie or?
I watched a series.
What did you watch?
I watched Supernatural.
What's that? Supernatural. What season is that on now?
15.
It's had 15 seasons?
It's the last season.
Holy cow. Okay. I was thinking about because it's filmed here, right?
Yeah.
Or is it still filmed here? I don't know with COVID. Yeah. It's filmed here and I've always thought, oh, maybe I'll start watching it, but with 15 seasons, I don't know if I want to commit to that. There's a lot of things on my list already. 15 seasons is, and how many episodes in a season?
Around 20.
I think I'm too far behind. It's pretty good though, right?
It's amazing.
Is it good? Okay. Okay, so that's good. That's one fun thing, right? Ryan is here. Good morning. Kevin is here. Good morning, Kevin. Shania is here. Good morning to you. And Michaela is here. Good morning, Michaela. So, just as a little bit of a public service announcement here. I want to say two things. Okay, maybe three things. The first thing maybe I'll say is for people who are coming into school, don't forget to be vigilant about COVID stuff. So don't forget to wash your hands, wear your mask in the hallways, wear it on the SkyTrain. And because I was reading an article this morning and there are schools that are having little outbreaks. I don't know if you've read or noticed, but we want to keep ourselves and our friends and our colleagues healthy as long as we can. So, be vigilant. COVID is everywhere. No, it's not everywhere. But still, just be vigilant. Second thing I wanted to tell you this morning is I think we should have a quiz on Friday, a little quiz. And so for in-class people, I think that will just look like a written thing. For online people, what I'll do is I'll do a video conference with you. And so I'll ask you questions verbally and you'll just kind of tell me what you know, okay? And so it'll be a little different for whether you're here or whether you're online, but it'll work out, trust me. The third thing I wanted to mention this morning is that I think we should start working on our first little micro paper this week. Woo. And so I'll put that together and maybe I will assign it to you tomorrow or Wednesday. And what I'll be looking for, I'll give you a little more detail when I hand it out to you. But good morning. What I'll be asking you to do is basically answer a question and answer it in a way that sort of uses some of the critical thinking skills we've already talked about. So presenting an argument, even if it's a very simple one, and creating a very short paper, maybe a page and a half or so. I tried 1 page last term, but I think it was a little too short. Some people were kind of running out. So I think just a little more room to breathe is better. It'll be about a page and a half. You'll make a very simple argument for me. You'll answer a question. You'll cite a source, and that'll be it. So it's not super complicated. I just want to see you do that for me. And again, my my working theory here, and I still don't know if it's true or not, but my working theory is that if you can write a short paper well, you can write a long one well, right? If you know how to build one, then you can, if you can write one that's 2 pages, you can write one that's 30. It's just more work, right? But if you understand kind of the sort of fundamental structure and sort of how to figure out what to include, and if you can sort of write sentences and paragraphs, you can write a paper that's as long as it needs to be, right? But again, I don't know that I need you to write 30 pages to see what I need to see. So that's why I tend to go shorter. But I'll give you a little more detail on that either tomorrow or Wednesday. And I will, maybe it's better for this one if I give you a question, like if I give you a topic to write on, just so you don't have to, yeah, I'll say this, I'll give you a topic to write on, but if there's something that you do, well, no, I'll give you something this time. Okay, thinking about this on the fly. Okay, so that's what we'll do. So quiz on Friday. It'll be a video conference oral quiz for online people. It'll be a written quiz here in class. It won't be a big deal. I will probably ask you, in class here, I'll probably ask you 5 questions, and I'll ask you to do short answers for them. So, a couple sentences or something like that. So it'll be very short, very simple. For online people, I'll ask you a couple questions, and you'll tell me what you know. So in theory, it should be about the same amount of work, I think. Okay, so that said, let's move on to, so last week we talked about critical thinking, we talked about arguments and what they were, and that we had a conclusion, a thing that an argument wanted us to believe, and we had premises that supported the conclusion. I created an argument about coffee that we assessed and decided it was a reasonably logical argument, even if it was not a complete argument, and even if there were maybe things that would overrule that, right? That would overrule you, maybe not agreeing with it, but sort of accepting my argument and drinking coffee yourself, right? And then you created your own arguments, which were all really good, right? We had different topics come up, but you seemed to understand the process, so that was good. We evaluated a few simple arguments, right? I had that list of different arguments, and we did that very well, so that was good. I was happy with that. And then we talked about nationalism versus patriotism, right? And so we said that nationalism had to do with defining a group of people by according to their culture or their language or their ethnicity or some such thing, right? Whereas patriotism had to do with the love of your political community, right? The state that you lived in. And so we said those things were kind of a little bit different, right? But sometimes we might confuse them in real life. Part of nationalism is that, or sort of the stronger form of nationalism is the idea that the only way to have a legitimate state is for people to be one nation, right? One nation within the boundaries of a country, living independently, making their own decisions, right? But again, even though that sort of idea has created many of the states we live in today, it's not really true, right? We don't have, in most cases, one nation living in one country. We have multicultural nations, right, for the most part. And so I asked you, could nationalism be a stabilizing or a destabilizing force? And I had you create a little argument and email that to me, and I'm still sifting through all those, but we'll talk about those ones tomorrow too. And I'm going to assume it would be okay if I put one of your arguments up on the screen and we talked about it, right? I wouldn't put your name up there with it. I would just put the argument itself. That's okay? No problem? Yeah? Okay. Just if I find a particularly good example, or if I find one that has something that I'd like to talk about, I'll put a few of them up there and we can discuss, but I won't I won't say whose it is because, I don't want to embarrass anyone, but I'll put them up there. Yeah, and I think, I think one of the things we talked about, and maybe some of the things you argued as well, was the idea that nationalism is useful, but it can also be very destructive, right? It's a unifying force. It can bring people together. It can get people to cooperate and have pride in themselves and maybe work harder than they otherwise would. And particularly in times that are difficult, right? If you're going through a pandemic or a war, a civil war, an economic depression, some sort of, catastrophic time in your history, nationalism can be used to rally the population and get them working harder, right? But we also probably know, because I think most of us know a little bit about history, that nationalism can be a dividing force as well. And here's what I want to point out to you about nationalism before we move on, is that it really depends, the kind of nationalism you have depends on where you draw the line, right? So nationalism means that there's us, there's the nation, and then there's other people. And so it depends where you draw that line around who is inside and who is outside. And so here in Canada, maybe if we wanted to create a form of nationalism that was based on just people living in Canada, right? That is, the nation is the people living in Canada. Their language, ethnicity, religion, race, sexuality doesn't matter. This is our nation, right? And that can be very useful, right? But if we were to say, and we're kind of seeing a little bit of this in the US, where many people believe that the nation is white, right? And so some Americans believe that America has been and should be a white country, right? And so by drawing the line around the nation in terms of only white people, you're excluding a massive amount of the population, and they can be disadvantaged and hurt by that, right? And of course, the extreme example of that is Nazi Germany, right? Where Adolf Hitler talks about the nation and he draws a line around it, but it's basically just pure-blooded German people, right? That's the nation. Everyone else is outside. It doesn't matter if you live in Germany. It doesn't matter if you've lived in Germany your entire life. It doesn't matter if your skin is white. It doesn't matter. It's just Germans that belong to the nation, and everyone else is disadvantaged by that. So again, it can be a very helpful thing, and it can be a very destructive thing, but the definition of the nation is really what the whole thing turns on, right? And so good morning, if you have an inclusive type of nationalism, then that can be, you can see good things come out of it. But nationalism can be divisive. And again, some political leaders will use that to their advantage, and they'll play one group in a country against another in order to gain power. And so we'll watch out for that in the news, but also as this course continues. All right, okay. So now I have a little section for you to read here. It is, I think it's just talking about the end of the war and the legacy and how we sort of transition out of 1919 into the early 1920s. Talks a little bit about the League of Nations, which we'll talk about. Yeah, so I'm going to give you some time to read. Online people, I'll give you some time to read too. The section you need to read is in Microsoft Teams, where it always is. So what I'll do is I'll give you 20 minutes. I'll give you 20 minutes to read and answer questions, and then we'll talk about it, okay? All right. Okay, so let's talk about this section. So we've said that in the Treaty of Versailles, of course, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, came to the negotiations with this idea of the League of Nations, right? This idea that all nations could sort of get together in a big assembly and they could sort of work together in order to address global problems and to prevent an outbreak of war, right? Basically trying to get everybody on the same global team, if you will. Yeah, trying to get everyone on the same global team. What was his rationale? What did he want out of this League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson? What did you write down for that?
Want the world to work together to stop, to protect each other's boundaries, and to give power to stop any country or group of countries to start a war. And see if there's no war.
Right. So he wanted the United Nations. He wanted the League of Nations to have the countries work together to respect each other's boundaries, and the second part was, of course, to prevent any wars. Right. So if two nations want to fight, something like NATO, yes, something like a later United Nations, some sort of group to either mediate between two conflicting nations or to apply pressure to countries to stop behaving badly, right? And so, what are some of the things that we learn about how the League of Nations works? So, who's part of the League of Nations, or who joins, or who doesn't?
Major powers.
Major powers join, and where do they sit?
Council.
Yeah, they sit on kind of a higher council within the League of Nations, right? And who are those big guys anyway? The British, the French, the Russians, Italy, Japan. Is Russia in there? Not.
They came in on 1934.
Right. So the Russians will gain membership a little bit later on, as will the Germans, right? But initially it's just Britain and France and Japan and.
So they said that the U.S. was supposed to be there, but they never came.
Right. What's that?
And they joined later on.
They joined later on, yeah. We said that was kind of probably a bit of a slap in the face to Woodrow Wilson, right? This is his big idea, and he negotiates it into the Treaty of Versailles, and he gets it passed, and he goes home to Congress and asks them to sign it, and they're like, no, thank you. Yeah, they don't sign it, and they don't join. And again, I want to re-emphasize the idea that the United States of this period is not the United States that we know, right? The United States at the time is very isolationist, right? So they're not really interested in global problems. They're not really interested in sticking their nose in European issues. Their economy is going well. Everything is fine at home for them. And they're just they just want to stick to themselves and not be bothered with anyone else at the moment. And of course that will change. If the America we know has its nose in everybody's business all the time, although I think we've seen Donald Trump is kind of returning the country to a more isolationist perspective, right? He's pulled out of climate accords, he's pulling out of the World Health, he's very much retreating to the kind of America that existed in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, an America that was not super interested in global problems or European problems, but just kind of more interested in taking care of them themselves. Whether that trend continues, I guess we'll see. But at the moment, the U.S. isn't too interested in getting involved in global affairs, and so they don't join. What other things do we learn about the League of Nations and how it kind of works?
The vote has to be unanimous.
Yes. So to pass a resolution, it's a democratic institution, right? People vote to pass a resolution for the League of Nations, you need a unanimous vote. Now, how realistic does that sound to you?
Everyone should vote on the same thing to pass it.
What's that?
Like everyone should say the same thing.
Yeah, so if the League of Nations, if you're in the League of Nations and we're all representing our, our home nations, and the question might be, should we place sanctions on Iran for violating the nuclear deal, let's say, even though I know that's not accurate, but still, I'm just... so the idea is for people to place sanctions on Iran, everyone would have to agree. Everyone would have to say yes. So if Iran has a seat at... Of course not, right? So it's very difficult in any democratic institution anywhere. It's very difficult to get everybody to agree. If you need a unanimous vote, sometimes you can do it with a small group. Like if you have 5 or 7 people, like a jury. Juries need to be unanimous, right, here in North America. So if you're going to convict someone and the jury has to decide, you might have 7 or 9 or 12 jurors, but they need to all agree. That needs to be unanimous. And even that is sometimes difficult to achieve. But when you have 63 different nations with different amounts of power and different agendas and different things they want, is it very reasonable that they will vote unanimously, that they'll all say yes to something? Not super reasonable, right? What's another problem with the United Nations, or the League of Nations here? At least I'm not saying the Justice League, right? What's another problem with the League of Nations?
I think we had meetings once a year.
They had meetings once a year?
Yeah, I think it was yearly meetings.
Okay.
Another problem was the US not being there because they were a major power.
Okay, let me back you up there. So why are yearly meetings a problem, would you say, Amanda?
Because problems don't come yearly.
Right, problems don't come yearly on schedule, right? Issues can crop up at any time, and if you're only meeting once a year, then something that you might want to involve yourself in might actually be over by the time you have the meeting, right? Or it might get really bad, right? So yeah, yearly meetings are not very useful. Global crisis don't wait for the yearly meeting, right? And the second thing you said, Amanda, was that the U.S. wasn't there. Why was that? Why is that an issue?
It's like the huge power back then. I think a lot of things centered around the Western powers at the time. So them not being there, it wasn't. I don't know. There wasn't full involvement of all the major powers.
Yeah, there wasn't full involvement of all the major powers, so the U.S. didn't join. And again, in this period, the U.S. is kind of an emerging superpower, right? So their economy is going like crazy. They've got lots of money. Things are happening for them, and they haven't really been involved in World War I, right? So World War I, we had, Britain broke, Germany is broke, Britain is broke, France is broke. Economically, they're all very weak. But the U.S. just showed up at the end. They didn't really invest that much in the war. They didn't really lose that much in the war. And so everyone else has kind of weakened themselves, and the U.S. is just starting to economically explode. And so, yeah, they've got a lot of military and financial power, but again, they're not really interested in getting involved in global situations, right? And of course, that's what the League is about, right? It's about getting involved in global situations. And so without that big, powerful country helping them out, yeah, it's less, right? The League of Nations is less and not as effective. So let's see. That was 2 and 5. Okay. So what did you say? Three reasons for the ultimate failure. of the League of Nations? What can we say that one is? Or what would you say one is?
So some of them didn't really want to, some of the members didn't really want to get involved.
Right. So there was not universal membership, right? Membership was voluntary, and some countries didn't join, and some very important countries didn't join.
They refused to take action during the Manchurian War.
Right. So during so the incident in Manchuria with Japan, they do not take any action. Should we or could we call that a reason for the failure? That's true, but what do you think?
I think it's them not having a large enough army.
Right, because they the League of Nations.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they have one?
No.
No, they don't. They don't have any army, right? And so, okay, so not everyone joins.
I think the book said that some things led to a lack of prestige for the nation, for the League of Nations. So, other nations like, okay, say whatever you want.
Yeah, well, and I think that's connected to Amanda's point too, the idea that they kind of lose prestige, right? They lose their authority. And part of it actually connects to the fact that, yes, they have no army, but how an organization like this works, if you want it to work, is if you're a country, you have to give up some of your sovereignty, right? So if you're a country, if I'm, I don't know, let's see, who can I be? Hungary, okay? I represent Hungary. I'm the president of Hungary in 1919. If I want the League of Nations to work, I have to give up a bit of my country's power to the League, right? I have to agree that if the League tells me to do something, I'm going to go along with it. I'm going to do it, right? If I don't do that, if I don't give up some of my sovereignty, if I don't give over some of my power to the League, does it have any power? No, right? Then the League will say, Hungary, we don't want you to do this thing. And Hungary will be like, yep, whatever, I'm doing whatever I want, right? So in order for these things to work, countries have to give up a bit of their sovereignty. They have to give up a bit of their power and agree to the League of Nations when they pass a resolution, or when they ask you to do something, or when they ask you to stop doing something, right? But does anyone want to do that? Does anyone want to do that? No, nobody wants to give up any of their sovereignty. Nobody wants to give up any of their powers. So can an organization like this actually work? No. Do they have a military, Amanda? No. So nobody has to listen to them. They don't have any military, so the League can't force anyone to listen to them. And so basically they're just talking in the wind, right? They have no teeth. They have no force behind their resolutions, right? And so not every member is present, right? Not every state joins the League. I think we could probably say that they have unanimous votes, or they need to have unanimous votes, and that's a problem because you can never get anyone to agree to everything, right? Here at the college, maybe I'll talk about this for a second. Here at the college, you may not know this, but the college is a charitable organization, civil society. And so we don't have an owner, so there's no owner like in the Cayman Islands, raking in the cash from all of our effort. That's not how it is. It's actually owned by a charitable organization. And so the charitable organization is a society of employees, and so we decide how the college works in a democratic fashion. And so we meet 3 times a year, all of the employees are society members, and we make the decision. So there's nobody, there's no big boss up there that owns the college telling us all what to do. We kind of tell ourselves what to do, and we vote on it. But nothing is ever unanimous. Most of our votes need 51% to pass. And some of the really important stuff, like if it was a really big thing, you would need 2/3. So you would need 67% of people to say yes in order for it to pass. So I'll just finish what I'm saying. Oh, there we go. So online people, sorry if that dropped out for a second. There was an internet connection problem, but hopefully, I'm not sure how much you missed, but hopefully not too much. So the League of Nations seems to have been, well, no, it doesn't seem to have been a failure. It was a failure. We know that. Because not all the members joined, particularly a major nation like the United States. They had to have unanimous votes, which of course is unreasonable because nobody ever agrees on anything. And I think they failed to give up their sovereignty. They failed to give up power to the league, and so therefore nobody has to listen to the league. Therefore, the league is powerless, right? But they did have some successes, though, right? And that's question number 5. What did they actually manage to accomplish?
I think they accomplished some stuff with employment and working conditions.
Right? So they made some progress in terms of employment and working conditions. What else did they achieve? Modest achievements, but something is better than nothing. What else did they achieve? Did they do anything about it?
Because yours says something about disease control.
Yeah, they do mention it in that part of the text. That's actually what we're going to talk about after the break. And so I'm not entirely sure what role the league was able to play, especially because the influenza epidemic of 1918 kind of starts in 1918, and the league, isn't really made official until 1919. So the league is kind of created at the tail end of the Spanish flu, and so I'm not sure if they're really able to get involved. But yeah, they do. Apparently, they have some progress around disease control, right? What else?
I think there was something having to do with research regarding HIV and AIDS. They aided research.
Yeah, they aided research. Probably.
I think that's part of the disease control.
Possibly, but HIV and AIDS doesn't appear until 1980. It wasn't called that?
That's what was in the
That that's what was it. Oh yeah, yeah. It in this one,
Not this one.
not this one. Okay. What else was there?
They counted the traffic of women, and dangerous drugs.
Right. So they made some progress in terms of limiting trafficking of women and dangerous drugs. Good. Yeah, communication and transportation issues, right?
Status of women and children.
Yeah, status of women and children. And so, and those things are all still within the current United Nations mandate as well, right? So the successor United Nations will continue doing some of those things, and those are some of the ways that I think even the United Nations today has been maybe more successful. They've been more successful in terms of on humanitarian and transportation and sort of global climate sort of topics. In terms of mediating between countries, I think they've been a little less successful, but I think some of the problems from the League of Nations still carry over to the modern United Nations, but we can deal with that a little bit later. Okay, you want to take a little break? Yeah? Okay. Let's take a little break. We'll come back in 10 minutes and we'll talk about the Spanish flu, as if we hadn't heard enough about pandemics. But So, oops. Okay, so we have talked a little bit about the League of Nations. We're probably not going to talk about it too much more because, as you can see, it's a pretty quick flop, right? It's basically created in 1919, and by 1933, member states are bailing or getting kicked out. It's been sort of established as not very effective, even though we've seen there's some progress in terms of, trafficking of women and drugs and the status of women and children and global health and things like that. Some progress is made, but I think the kind of big hopes for the League of Nations have not been realized. And so we'll read about that maybe a little bit tomorrow, what happens in Manchuria and what happens in Ethiopia, kind of convince people that the League is not as useful as maybe people once hoped. And so, yeah, within about a 10-year span, it's proven ineffective, right? Yeah, and we said because, part of it had to do, I think, with the design of the League, so the need for unanimous votes and the idea that not every member or not every country was actually a member, but also in terms of people's commitment to it. And so again, you have to give up some of your power in order to make something like this work. And if no one is willing to listen to what the League says, then it's pointless, right? The whole thing is kind of pointless. And so, yeah, this is a worthy of talking about, however, because it's kind of the first step toward some sort of global body that works toward, problems that affect everyone. And, and it might be worth thinking about that in our present world, because a lot of the problems that we face, or at least some of the big ones, are global problems, right? What's a global problem that people are facing right now? What's that? Yeah, coronavirus, right? That is a global problem. It's not any one country's problem. Can any one country solve it? No, right? It requires everyone to work together and share knowledge with each other and, to beat this thing, right? It's not one country's problem, and it's not one country's responsibility, right? Everybody has to work together. What's another one? What? Oh, Black Lives Matter. Yeah, I don't know, global problem? Maybe not necessarily. What's that? It's definitely flaring up in the United States most strongly. I wouldn't say it's restricted to that country. There's other countries where their black citizens are disadvantaged. I think we could say the problem is probably worse in the U.S. in that regard. But it exists in other places, but not globally. Another global challenge: global warming or climate change or environmental destruction, anything to do with the health of our planet, right? None of that is one country's fault, and certainly no one country can solve it, right? We have to work together in order to take care of the environment. And I would argue so far we haven't done a very good job at doing that. There's been some steps, right? But we are, I don't think we've really committed to it yet, right? Yeah, and Michaela says that too. She says climate change. What about other ones? Global challenges that might require global response. Well, yeah. Well, we're seeing China start to flex its muscles on the international stage, right? And so some countries are sort of getting nervous about that, and whether that becomes a global problem, it may become a problem for Western nations who China is kind of in direct opposition to, right? So whether that becomes a global challenge or just a Western one, I guess remains to be seen, right? Nobody's quite sure what China's kind of end game is here, so I guess we'll find out. But it's not impossible, right? Another one. Nobody's going to say alien invasion.
No, we're okay with that.
You were probably okay in that department. But, you know, in a fictional sense, maybe not fictional, but yeah, I mean, if, you know, aliens were to come from another planet, that would probably require a global response, right? That would not be one country's problem. That might be everybody's problem. What about population increase? Huh?
World hunger.
Say again?
World hunger.
World hunger, right? That's a global problem. Pollution, yeah, pollution's a global problem. Overpopulation is a global problem, right? We have our Earth's population is growing and growing and growing, and we only have one Earth, right? And so if our population continues to grow, eventually we may get to a point where we just do not have enough resources on this little ball for everyone.
I heard people are buying tickets to Mars.
Maybe some people. There's nothing on Mars at the moment. I don't think would anyone want to live on Mars?
Maybe some really desperate people.
Or adventurous people, maybe. I don't know.
How much of an adventure to get to dead planet.
I don't know. It looks.
Earth is going to be a dead planet soon.
When I look at our planet, I think it's beautiful, and when I look at the surface of Mars, I don't think that. So I don't know. I don't know if I'd want to live on a red rock in the middle of space. But
Well, you've not seen the whole planet.
I think it's all like that. I think it's all red rock. I think. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and so yeah, Shania said overpopulation too. So yeah, those are global issues, right? They're not just restricted to one country. But again, I don't know that we've really banded together globally to handle things like this, to handle climate change, to handle overpopulation, to handle environmental pollution, and you know, even to manage global health. I mean, did we do a good job as a global society with this coronavirus thing? What would you give us out of 10 in terms of a global society in terms of handling coronavirus?
The whole world 95 and North Korea 8.5.
The whole world gets a 5. Well, it's definitely been variable, right? Depending on the country you live in, and you know, some factors in terms of timing and luck, but some factors in terms of actual choices people make. Yeah, there's been a real difference in how countries have been affected, right? So we've, whether we've cooperated or not as a global society, it's definitely impacted certain countries much more significantly than others, right? Okay, speaking of coronavirus, we probably can't leave this period of history, this sort of end of the war period, without talking about the influenza epidemic. And it's interesting because it's something that, you know, with the exception of this little purple part here, it's a part of the World War I story that often gets skipped over, and because it happens kind of right at the end of the war, and of course there's so much happening at that time, it often gets forgotten about when we talk about history. And I will admit that in teaching this class before, I just skipped over it. I'm like, oh yeah, and some people got the flu. Anyway, moving on. But of course, you know, now that we are in the midst of our own pandemic, suddenly the Spanish flu of 1918 becomes, you know, seemingly much more significant, right? So I thought we should take a few minutes and read about it and just talk about it, because of course we are living through this similar experience right now. So maybe what I'll invite you to do is, take 10 minutes, read through this, and then we'll see if we can get through the questions in the last 5 minutes, and if not, we'll just pick it up tomorrow. But 10 minutes, give it a read, and then we'll we'll talk. And we should all probably be experts in pandemics by now, so it'll probably be easy. But sorry? Oh, it's page 22. I'm sorry, page 22. And of course, online people, it's in the files section of Microsoft Teams, so you can do it too. Okay, 10 minutes and then we'll talk. So, since we only have a few minutes left, I think I will leave it till tomorrow. We'll talk about the influenza epidemic here of 1918, and then we'll kind of move on into the 1920s, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about 1920s kind of culture and what's happening in the U.S. because that's kind of interesting and fun. I'm going to try and find a video for you. I have one that's actually quite long, but I'm going to see if I can find something a little shorter that will show us what we need to see, because if you ever go back in time, this is important. If you remember nothing else from this class, remember this. If you ever go back in time, you may want to go back to the 1920s because it's a really fun time. There's lots of great music and everyone's partying and drinking. There's lots of technological change and excitement, at least in the US anyway. Don't go back to Germany in the 20s. It's bleak. But in the US, it's a great time to be alive, and for people your age, it's a great time to be young. But anyway, that said, I will leave that until tomorrow. Online people, thank you for being here. Tomorrow we'll pick up the influenza thing and we'll go on to the 20s, and I'll see you tomorrow.